Good morning, brethren. This morning we continue our theme of studying the Word of God, and we're going to be working further into 1 Corinthians chapter 13. This morning we're going to be looking at verse 5. Love is not rude. It is not self-seeking. It's not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrong. I'm not quite sure if you have ever seen an extremely huge fire before. I think often we watch it in especially California when they have the seasons of fire, that the fires, once it gets going, it's devastating. And the illusion is that once you've put the fire out, that the heated logs underneath the floor brush that is not visibly seen stop smoldering. I think when one looks at a fire, immediately a lot of thoughts comes up that we are helpless and hopeless. We feel vulnerable, and that can continue for so long. We watch the relief when rain comes. And I remember when we had fires over the mountains, we asked God for rain, and He sent it. Many years ago, I've seen a fire take a house. I watched how the house burnt down, and it was terrible to watch how everything that they have saved reduced to ashes. But what was even more scary is that they would put out the fire, but there was still a smoldering going on underneath. And even though the firemen would have left a couple of days later, suddenly it would be ablaze again because the fire is still smoldering below the surface. And this is how dangerous a fire is. But in the same way, it can be as dangerous with people that are angry. First of all, anger can be explosive. In other words, you equate it to an explosive, raging fire. We find that it's like throwing a match into something that's flammable. It takes off and it flames uncontrollably. But there's another kind of anger which is more subtle. And that is the one that seemingly has been put out, but underneath smolders for days, for weeks, and for months. It's slowly waiting there for an impulse or a catalyst to explode. It's like a volcano that's always there. And both of those are called anger. In other words, you might be a person that do not get angry, but inside you are seething. You are angry, and people call that passive aggression. And sometimes being pushed hard enough, that will become an explosion. Both are dangerous. When God speaks about His people of Israel, He speaks to them about in Hosea chapter 7 and verse 6, where He says, their hearts are like an oven. Their anger smolders all night long, but in the morning it bursts into flaming fire. And so often we find that these kind of things happens in the lives of especially Christians, especially in us who are working and submitted our lives to God. We are also tempted to exhibit the same kind of behavior. In our study in 1 Corinthians 13, we looked specifically, and I want you to know, we are specifically talking about the manifestations of agape love. In other words, the godly love. Godly love is patient and kind, and it is not envious, it's not boastful, or it is not proud. It's not rude or self-seeking. And in verse 5 it says, it is not irritable or resentful. The NIV puts it in a beautiful way. It says, it's not easily angered, and it keeps no records of wrongs. Which is another way of saying that it doesn't smolder all the time. It doesn't just stay below the surface and suddenly it'll burst out and the person would say, now where does that come from? One of the key areas in your and my life is to be aware that's not what love is. Psychologists has mentioned recently that we live in an age of rage, where people are becoming angrier and angrier. We witness people's rage, especially on aeroplanes, where they refuse to wear a mask or where they are not happy with the service. We watch how they rant and rave at people who are serving them and shout at other people. But God takes us right back to Cain and Abel, where we see the uncontrolled rage between two brothers. In Genesis chapter 4, verse 3 through 8, where Cain would have killed his brother out of a seething anger. He saw his brother Abel was serving God as best that he could, and that God honored and recognized his sacrifice to God. He was envious and he wanted to kill his brother, or rather he did kill him. Psychology tells us there are two kinds of anger. The one is blowing up and the other one is clamming up. 1 Corinthians 13 is our best reference, which says that love is not irritable and it's not resentful. I'm going to touch on two ways in which anger can manifest itself. First and foremost, love is not easily angered. The word in the Greek would mean he does not blow up. In other words, he does not explode. 1 Corinthians 13:5, love is not irritable. Love is not easily angered. And other translations says that love is not easily provoked, or love is not quick-tempered. The Greek word is a very nice word that speaks of paroxono. And the word basically means exploding. In other words, it reminds you of a person carrying a chip on his shoulder and is just waiting for something to put a match to it, and that person will explode. And sometimes in each one of us, we have the propensity to rage and become angry if people would push you hard and long enough. Brethren, I want you to know in a lot of ways is that we are busy with a war of attrition. It is a war that is going on against Christianity, where you and I need to exhibit the qualities that God has exemplified to us. And all the way through, you will find that Satan is going to try to push and push and push your buttons. But all the way through, you and I need to deepen and deepen and deepen our relationship with God. We can see that this explosion can either be a good thing or a bad thing on the situation. Acts 17, Paul's visiting Athens. He sees a city that is filled with idols and false gods. Verse 16 says, now while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, his spirit was provoked within him, and he saw that this city was full of idols. The word paroxono means that Paul's spirit exploded. There was a violent action within Paul where he could not stand still and keep quiet any longer. And he responds to that. His action is explosive to say that this kind of worship is out. Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 24. And Paul writes to the church at Hebrews, he says, let us consider how to stir one another up to love and good works. The King James Version says, let us consider one another to provoke unto love and good works. These words, again, stirring up one another, provoking one another, is the same word. Let's ignite one another so that we can be ablaze for Christ. In other words, there is another positive way that being explosive can be used. The idea of being on fire for Jesus is something that is not inappropriate, because it speaks about something that is being jolted in and energized through the love of Christ and the love for Christ. The Hebrew writer would be saying, think of ways that we can ignite one another. Find a way to jolt each other into action. Make the desire to love and good works explode in each other's lives. Make love an explosive response inside of all of our lives. In that way, it's an incredible thing. But there's a negative side to that. In Acts chapter 15, we see that Paul and Mark, on their second missionary journey, we find that Paul and Barnabas had a problem. They disagreed with one another in such a way that actually it drove both of them in opposite directions. Acts 15 verse 39, and there arose a sharp disagreement so that they separated from each other. Sharp disagreement, again, paroxono. In other words, the idea that here was such a violent reaction between these two men that they went into opposite ends. We know that that didn't remain the same way, because they came together again. In fact, Paul asks for Mark to come and see him while he's in prison in 2 Timothy. 1 Corinthians 13, Paul speaks to us and he says that love does not explode. Love is not easily angered. It's not somebody that wants his own way all the time and always gets irritated when his way is not met. It's not somebody who is childish, where he can't play the game, expel his somni. You see, brethren, many times we have opportunities to lose our temper. And I've always mentioned to you the example of home affairs, and I also mentioned standing in line at the municipalities and all else. But we must note that everyone stands in those queues. Everyone is exposed to the same pressures of being there to finalize their business. And exploding at somebody behind the counter that is trying to help us is inappropriate. You see, sometimes we have this feeling that my time is more important than yours. How dare you ignore the fact that that is an opportunity for you and I to show the kindness to everybody that we are in contact with. Our hospitals are overfilled and overburdened. And so many great nurses and doctors are working in our public services to serve us to the very best of their ability. They've given their lives and answered this divine calling to serve humanity. Let's honor them before God. And as we see them really struggling, remember they come from homes where they are battling to make ends meet and under the same pressures you and I are under. Let's be kind and make their life pleasant. Many years ago, I was in Namibia with my cousin. And we were walking around as kids, and he took a catty and threw it into a hornet's nest. I'm not quite sure if you know how this thing works. You know, brethren, I think it's the height of stupidity as children. But one of the nicest things that I was standing behind him. And so the hornet went for him. He shot it, he got it. And I'll never forget seeing this thing. You know, the difference with those hornets in Namibia is that they, in fact, do not, like a bee, they don't pull out the sting and die. They can stick you a numerous amount of times. And every time it hurts just more. And I'll never forget that he got stung on his arm. And he looked at his arm and literally watched as it was swelling. In the same way, brethren, it's the kind of thing that love is very careful. That there is a consequence that just ripples out into humanity because we all are relational. So every person's action has an effect on someone else. You see, brethren, once you touch the hornet's nest, all kinds of things start flying out. Isn't it ironic that during those moments, we watch the most colorful language come out when people are in arguments? We watch how they will rail against each other and say the kind of things which they would not normally do if they had been in a situation that was controlled or calm. You see, brethren, we need to react as Jesus did. Love never acts in retaliation. Love doesn't go around with a chip on the shoulder and just saying to everybody, you wait, just mess with me and you'll see. You see, brethren, you and I are always aware of the actions and the consequences. Phillips paraphrased it like this. He says, love is not touchy. In other words, love is not like having people walk around you on eggshells. And sometimes we like that because it's a manipulative tactic that everybody must be scared of you because ultimately you're going to be the one that's going to blow out at them, even if they speak to you. And that's not true, and that's not Christian. And our feet can be held to the fire because of that and say that's not the way we do things. You see, brethren, when we look at these things, we see the devastation it leaves behind in the lives of so many people. We've seen how fathers have treated their children with such absolute disgraceful conduct, with anger, and we watch it displayed in their children. And we watch how their daughters become so worried that anybody that speaks decently to them, they are reminded of the trauma they experienced with their father. And those kind of things has a massive ripple effect. In other words, a Christian thinks exactly how he operates. The Bible has a lot to say about losing one's temper. Proverbs 19:11 says, good sense makes one slower to anger, and it is his glory to overlook an offense. Ecclesiastes 7 verse 9 says, do not be quick in your spirit to become angry, for angry lodges in the heart of a fool. This passage is one that got me to repentance. James chapter 1 verse 19 to 20. Let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. For the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. In other words, losing your temper and trying to say that I'm doing it because of righteousness' sake, you are not acting according to God's word. And therefore God says to you, you need to be temperate. You need to exercise the fruit of the Spirit to be self-controlled, to be able to be measured in the way that you speak, in the way that you respond, that you submit yourself to the control of God, that ultimately whatever you say is done in a way that honors God. One of the most destructive forces of humanity is to be quick-tempered. And you watch how it has damaged people. And their interrelatability is being altered because of that. They become cowards. They run away. They make every excuse not to engage an enemy. Why? Because they've been so manipulated and pushed into the ground by their family or parents. When children are being taught how to engage in a way that is constructive, it becomes very different. There's an Italian proverb that says, anger is a very expensive commodity. There was a story I watched a while ago about a guy who lost a 23 million rand sports contract. I'm not quite sure if you've heard about Will Smith raging at the Oscars. I don't watch it, but that certainly caught my eye. Be careful what you say in anger. It may be the best speech that you will say, but you will live to regret it. We watch how his best friend spoke to him afterward and said to him, Will, you need to reel it in. Because this is being used by the enemy to target you and to trigger you to act outside of God's will. You need to reel it in. You see, brethren, we look at these celebrities and we follow their examples, but we follow the example of Christ. You see, brethren, especially with Christians, we must understand that there's a far greater and eternal consequence when we lose our tempers. These past few months and years have been provided adequate opportunity to lose tempers. But that's not the time or the place. Because the consequence of action, or rather, action that is not carefully thought through and submitted to Christ. And that is why Paul in 2 Corinthians 10 would say, he says, take every thought captive and make it submissive to Christ. And the idea is that every single thing that we do contemplatively. The Afrikaans has a wonderful way of saying, ons Christenskap is gebore en verdiep deur denktijd. En na betrachting, we think things through before we act. The word forget is a very strong word used in 1 Corinthians. Where Paul speaks about love is not resentful. He's now talking in the NIV and says he keeps no record of wrongs. In other words, he doesn't hold on to grudges. The Greek word is an accounting word, which means that you keep a ledger of the exact detail of people's lives. That you sit down and hold down careful notes of who did what wrong. It's like a bookkeeper writing up something in a ledger so that they do not forget. Brethren, let me say this to you, be very careful. There is the book of life that God is keeping on us. And you know, all the way through, we live in the shadow of the cross, knowing, Lord, that there are things that we do wrong that we want you to forget and erase out of your book of life so that our name will remain there. Paul's trying to say to you and I, don't do that. Don't keep a ledger of people's wrongs. I will never forget, I spoke to a dear friend of mine, and many years ago, and we were just talking privately, and he burst into tears, him and his wife, and I said, what's wrong? He said, brother, I was in, and he mentioned the person's office, where there is detailed notes on the lives of people in the church. Details. I spoke to a man in counseling many years ago, and when I was sitting with him, I said, "What's the problem between the two of you?" He said, "Give me a minute." And he went to his filing cabinet, he took out a folder, and he says, "Can I speak now?" I said, "Yes." And he detailed in fine detail what his wife had done wrong over the past few years, going back to the first day that they got married. You watch the absence of love, the absence of resolving conflict, and taking it to God and the person and saying, "Let's forgive." Somebody made a comment to me the other day and said that a woman never gets hysterical, they get historical. Where they remember everything that you've done wrong, but I want to shock you, there's some men that do the same. They do the same. The poor woman, she has tried to think that that has been resolved. And then he will raise it up again and says, but remember. And it's all manipulation, and God wants us out of that manipulation of relationships. God is a relational God, and that is why He forgives us, because He wants us to put it behind and move on and live in the present of this wonderfully redeemed life with all its beautiful opportunities that it presents to us every single day. Brethren, sometimes I am blown away how we hamstring others, our spouses, our friends, and our family. You know, sometimes we want to remember from way back from our primary school days, high school days, and university days. Sometimes we want to remind everybody about whatever has said and how and what they have lied about us. Brethren, it calls us to then become bitter and miserable people. And that smoldering, when we spoke about earlier, will take light. It just stays in the bottom of your heart, where all the time you just live there and you're on nursing this little fire, and you say, well, I can't remember, forget this. I can't remember what he or she did to me. I've got to nurse it constantly. You see, brethren, love doesn't hold a grudge. It definitely doesn't keep a record of wrong. It definitely doesn't nurse the pain so that you are held captive by all these things. Sue taught me a lesson this week, and we were just talking, and it was something that she read. And she said to me, you know what, brethren, when we become addicted to anger and pain and all those kind of things, it's the only prison that has a key on the inside. It is the only prison that holds a key on the inside for you to unlock, step through the blood of Christ, and be redeemed forever. There's an illustration that I want to raise to you. What is forgiveness? Well, forgiveness is simply not wanting the person to suffer in the same way that you have. But there's a little story which illustrates this about a 6-year-old boy came crying to his mom, and he said to her, Mom, you know, my sister has pulled my hair and it is very painful. And his mom said to him, please don't be angry. Your little sister doesn't realize that pulling hair hurts. I think it's good advice. Short while later, the mom heard more crying, and she went to investigate, and the little sister was crying. And then the brother looked up at her and says, well, Mom, what you said is true, but now she knows that it hurts. You see, brethren, sometimes we need to not go that route, because it's a conscious choice not to inflict the same damage and damning on other people that you've suffered. The rejection, the slander, the gossip, the lies. Don't do that. It'll take you down a path which Satan is patiently waiting for you. And when you walk into Satan's territory, brethren, he will mess with your mind in ways that you have not even begun to imagine. You see, brethren, the question on the table is, let's say there's a bunch of people in one big room where we're playing a game of revenge, and the one person, and each one of us are given a baseball bat. The question on the table might be, who's going to go first? And that's what Jesus did to the young girl when he dealt with her caught in adultery in John chapter 8. Who's going to go first? Who of you are going to go first? Who's going to hit first? Who's going to be the one that's going to be responding in anger immediately, and who's going to be the one that's going to be smoldering? Who's going to escalate the harm? Can you imagine our whole society is like that? Revenge, keeping a record of wrong. And sometimes, brethren, the shocking thing is that sometimes you find, especially between husband and wife, and even people that are in the streets or even that we know and acquaintances, these memories and keeping records of wrong run deep. We must be careful. There's a story of the Polynesian islands where people that the natives there, what they used to do is, whenever they have been angered, they would take a little token from that person's home and they would hang it up in their house to remind them every single day of what that person did to them. Can you imagine living in a house where all around you every single day you can stare and look at who and what everybody did to you? Could you imagine living a life like that? Could you imagine living totally entrapped? Psalms 103, verse 12, as far as the east is from the west, so far does he remove our transgressions. Hebrews 13, verse 17, this is the covenant that I will make with them. I will remember their sins and their lawless deeds no more. Brethren, if you remember the story of Joseph, one of my greatest heroes, brethren, they treated him so badly. They hated him. They wanted to kill him. They threw him into a pit, sold him off as a slave. He was sent to prison for 13 years for something that he had not done. He was far away from his family, far away from his friends. The most essential element of socialization has been robbed of this man, and the only place that he could be was sit in a prison with 4 walls. You see, brethren, he was there for over 20 years. 13 years, and I know it's a full about 20 years. Eventually, brethren, when his brothers came to him, he looked at them. And in some people's mind, they would say, well, Joe, you've got every single right to now take out all the rage on these people because of what they had done. Remember, you had 20 years to think about this. Joseph did not. He made the question, and he places a rhetorical question before each one of us this morning and says, am I God to judge you? Am I in the place of God to judge you? And that rhetorical question is what drives us as Christians, that there's an exclusive right that only belongs to God. And when God forgives us, we loosen ourselves from that sin. We loosen ourselves even from the person who has sinned against us. Love and resentment cannot coexist in the same heart. It's just not true. Sometimes we can live with this kind of resentment just right in the bottom here, like a little volcano. And somehow we feel that we are justified. God is saying to you and me this morning, you are never justified. You are my holy temple, where the Spirit of holiness lives within you. And brethren, this at this moment in time, within the church's hearts, is crucial to understand, to get rid of anything that stands between us. There was a story of 2 children that were having an argument. And the mother said to the one child, he says, you need to be nice to your brothers and stop hitting them every time you get angry. And the child says, well, Mom, my heart isn't working that well. He's a good friend of mine, and I'm so honored to have him as one of the men that mentor me. And once a month or so, and I know he's watching, we have a phone call, and he phones from a foreign country. And we sit and talk, and I'm just so honored to be his friend. I get notes from him. And he always said to me, brother, always know it's a heart condition. And brethren, this morning I want to speak to your heart. Don't play games with your soul. You know, Jesus Christ ripped me in my heart. And Afrikaans says, tot stilstand. Where he says that he who does not believe is unforgiven. Who does not forgive is unforgiven. Brethren, anger is dangerous. And sometimes we find, brethren, that it is something we can relate to, and sometimes we feel it is something that we are justified. Brethren, you're a child of God. His holiness and your soul is the seat of His holiness. We never have that right to mess with holiness and contaminate what rightfully belongs to God. This is a hard sermon for me because, brethren, as you deal with stuff that is so painful, when you see those whom you love being hurt, the innocent, you want to sob and say, Lord, how long? How long? And then you want to become angry. And then this Bible that we love so much stands and says, try to get past this, my boy. And this morning while I was taking the Lord's Supper and I looked at that empty cross, try to get past that. I can't. And that is why when we study these scriptures together and deepen our walk with God and understanding of His will for our lives, we start to see our lives very differently. And we start to taste what Andre spoke about just now, where he says, I want to be crucified with Christ. And he says, for I no longer live, but Christ lives within me. Maybe this morning you're struggling with keeping records of wrongs, bitterness, anger, unforgiveness. Let me say this to you. God is knocking at your door and saying, let's deal with it. Let's deal with it. That's not what you've been designed for. Let's stand and sing our final song for this morning. Let's stand and sing together.